The courtroom was dead silent. Patricia Bennett sat frozen, her fate hanging in the balance. The evidence was overwhelming. Her billionaire husband had been poisoned and all fingers pointed at her. The judge prepared to read the verdict. But then a small voice broke through the tension. "Mommy didn't do it." Gasps filled the room. All eyes turned to Charlotte, Patricia's 6-year-old daughter, clutching her doll. And when she whispered 4 words, the prosecutor's face went pale. "Ask about the tea. Want to know what happened next? Watch until the end for this gripping story full of twists and emotions. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories like this." The courtroom was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the thick, suffocating kind, the kind that weighed heavy on the chest, the kind that preceded something irreversible. Patricia Bennett sat at the defense table, her hands clasped, so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She kept her gaze forward, trying to steady her breath, but the weight of 100 eyes pressing against her skin made it impossible to think. She had been here for weeks, trapped in this cold, wooden chair, listening to people dissect her life. Every mistake, every moment of weakness dragged into the light and held up as evidence. The judge, Leonard Watson, an older man with deep lines etched into his face, cleared his throat. "This court is now in session." A sharp crack of the gavel. The murmurs from the gallery died instantly. On the other side of the courtroom, Gregory Martinez, the district attorney, straightened his tie. He looked as polished as ever, calm, confident, utterly convinced of her guilt. And why wouldn't he be? The case against Patricia was airtight. The poison that had killed her husband, Walter Bennett, had been found in her home. A substance so rare, so specific, that there was no way it had gotten there by accident. The jury had seen the footage, the video that played over and over again in court, showing her in the kitchen that night, preparing tea. The last thing Walter ever drank. Patricia swallowed hard. She knew what everyone in this room was thinking. She could hear the headlines already. The Black Widow of Park Avenue. It didn't matter that she had loved Walter once, that they had built a life together, that not long ago she had stood beside him at charity galas, smiling for the cameras. None of that mattered now, because today was the day the jury would decide if she had murdered him. The air was so thick. With tension, Patricia could barely breathe. And then, just as the judge took a breath, just as the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived, a small voice cut through the silence, a voice so soft, so unexpected, that it sent a ripple through the courtroom. "Mommy?" Patricia's stomach turned to ice. Slowly, she turned her head toward the gallery, and there, standing on tiptoe behind the wooden railing, was her 6-year-old daughter, Charlotte, clutching her porcelain doll with both hands. Her lower lip trembled. Her tiny voice, barely more than a whisper, carried through the stunned courtroom. "Mommy, why are they saying you hurt Daddy?" A hush fell over the room, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Patricia felt something shift, a crack in the perfect wall of certainty that had been built against her. Because there was one thing, one terrible, undeniable thing that no one in this room had considered, and Charlotte was about to say it. For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom, packed with reporters, attorneys, and jurors, seemed to freeze in place. The scratch of a pen, the rustle of fabric, every small noise had vanished, swallowed by the weight of that single question. "Mommy, why are they saying you hurt Daddy?" Patricia Bennett could feel every eye on her. The cold, watchful stares of the jury, the narrowed gaze of Gregory Martinez, the district attorney, the silent judgment of strangers who had already decided she was guilty before the trial had even begun. She couldn't turn. She couldn't look at Charlotte. If she did, she would break. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the table, trying to ground herself. Her attorney, Douglas Powell, shifted beside her, his voice low and urgent. "Stay composed," he murmured. "Do not react." Easy for him to say, because he wasn't the one on trial for murder. The judge, Leonard Watson, exhaled sharply, adjusting his glasses as he peered over the bench. "Who allowed this child into the courtroom?" he asked, his voice gruff. A few. Heads turned. There was murmuring in the gallery. I didn't mean to." Charlotte's tiny voice wavered. She clutched her doll tighter, her little fingers curling around its fabric dress. Patricia swallowed, willing herself to stay still, to breathe evenly. "Bailiff," the judge said with a tired sigh, "please escort the child outside." But before the bailiff could move, Charlotte took another step forward, and this time her voice was louder. "Mommy didn't do it." A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone gasped. A reporter's pen scratched furiously against a notepad. Patricia's pulse pounded in her ears. She finally turned just slightly, just enough to see Charlotte's face. Her daughter's big brown eyes were wide, shining with something Patricia hadn't seen in weeks. Conviction. "Charlotte," Patricia finally whispered, her throat tight. "Go with the officer, sweetheart. I'll see you soon." But Charlotte didn't move. Instead, she hugged the doll closer to her chest and said something else, something so quiet, yet so powerful, that the courtroom seemed to tilt. "Daddy didn't drink Mommy's tea." Patricia stopped breathing. Across the room, Gregory Martinez stiffened, the confident mask on his face flickering for just a second. Patricia's lawyer turned sharply toward her, his brows furrowed. "What is she talking about?" he hissed. Patricia's lips parted, but no sound came out, because the truth was, she didn't know. Charlotte was right. Walter hadn't drunk her tea that night. So what had he drunk? And why was Charlotte the only one who seemed to remember? A ripple of unease passed through the courtroom, the kind that happened when something didn't fit. Daddy didn't drink Mommy's tea. Patricia could still hear her daughter's voice, fragile yet unwavering, like a thread pulling at the very foundation of the case against her. But the foundation wasn't supposed to crack. Gregory Martinez recovered quickly, straightening his papers as if brushing off the comment. "The child is confused," he said, addressing the judge. "She's 6 years old, hardly a reliable witness." Murmurs rose in the courtroom. Patricia clenched her fists in her lap. The prosecutor wanted to sweep this under the rug, but something in Charlotte's voice, it wasn't confusion. It was certainty. Her attorney, Douglas Powell, leaned in. "Is there anything to this?" he whispered urgently. "Was there another cup of tea that night?" Patricia opened her mouth, then hesitated. The truth was, that night was a blur. She remembered the dim glow of the kitchen lights, the sound of rain against the glass. She had made tea, yes. Walter had been in his office as usual, locked away behind heavy doors. She had prepared a cup for herself, a cup for him. But had he actually drunk it? A slow, creeping sense of unease settled in her chest. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're getting distracted," he muttered. But before he could dismiss Charlotte entirely, Douglas stood. "Your Honor, I request a recess," he said quickly. Martinez scoffed. "Recess? Based on the imagination of a 6-year-old? Douglas didn't back down. Based on a detail that has never been addressed in this trial. If there was another cup of tea, if there's a possibility that Walter Bennett drank something else, then dismissing this could be a miscarriage of justice." The word miscarriage carried weight. The judge's expression hardened. He looked at Charlotte, who still clung to her doll, her tiny shoulders rising and falling in nervous breaths. A long silence followed. Then, 15-minute recess, Judge Watson announced, banging his gavel. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Lawyers whispered among themselves. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. And Patricia? She sat there, frozen, as a single terrifying thought crawled into her mind. What if she had been so convinced of her own guilt that she had failed to see the truth staring her in the face? The moment Patricia stepped out of the courtroom, the Walls seemed to close in around her. The buzz of voices, the flashing cameras, the hurried footsteps of reporters, it all blurred together. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Charlotte's words looped in her mind, gnawing at her like an itch just out of reach. She had spent weeks defending herself against accusations, against the certainty of the police, the prosecution, the press. The poison had been found in her home. It had been linked to the tea. Her tea. But what if they had all been looking at the wrong cup? Douglas caught up with her, his face unreadable. "You need to tell me everything you remember about that night," he said, his voice low. Patricia exhaled sharply. I thought I already did." "No, you told me what you think happened. I need what you know happened." She shut her eyes, tried to reach back through the fog of that night. Walter had been angry. That much was clear. She had heard the irritation in his voice, the clipped way he spoke when she knocked on his office door. "Not now, Patricia." She had gone back to the kitchen. Boiled water. Let the tea steep. The scent of chamomile and honey filled the air. Then her eyes fluttered. "Open? I never actually saw him drink it," she murmured. Douglas frowned. "What?" She swallowed hard. "I made the tea. I left it on the counter. Then something distracted me." "What?" Patricia shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe the rain. Maybe Charlotte calling from upstairs." She could feel the details slipping, shifting in her memory like sand through her fingers. But then another thought, a flash of something. Someone else had been in the kitchen. Her stomach twisted. Douglas studied her face. "Who?" Patricia's mouth went dry. There was only one person who could have been there. The only other person in the house that night. Eleanor Bennett, Walter's mother. The grieving widow. The woman who had sat in the front row of the courtroom. Every single day, her face unreadable, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The woman who had never once looked at Patricia during the entire trial. A chill ran down Patricia's spine. "Douglas," she whispered, "I think I left the tea in the kitchen, and I think Eleanor was there." Douglas didn't blink. "Are you saying—" Patricia shook her head quickly. I don't know. But what if Walter never drank my tea?" Her voice cracked. "What if he drank hers?" Silence. Then Douglas straightened, his lawyer's mind already spinning. "We need to see the security footage from that night." Patricia's pulse roared. In her ears. She had spent this entire trial fighting to prove her innocence, but now, for the first time, she realized she might not have been the only one with something to hide. Douglas didn't waste time. Within minutes, he was already making calls, demanding access to the unedited security footage from the night Walter died. Patricia sat in the empty conference room next to him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her nails dug into her skin. The courthouse walls felt too tight, too cold. Eleanor, the thought of her mother-in-law being in the kitchen that night before Walter died, made Patricia's skin crawl. Eleanor had been mourning publicly for weeks, her grief a quiet, dignified thing. She never shed dramatic tears, never made a scene, but she had never defended Patricia either, not once. Douglas tapped his fingers against the table impatiently, waiting for a response from his contact. Patricia exhaled, pressing her fingertips to her temple. If Eleanor was in the kitchen, what does that mean? Douglas didn't look up from his phone. It means we've spent weeks focused on the wrong thing. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Douglas's phone buzzed. He answered immediately. Powell speaking. Yes, that's exactly what I need. Send it over now. A pause. Then his expression darkened. What do you mean there's missing footage? Patricia's blood turned to ice. Douglas straightened in his chair, his tone sharpening. Missing how? Corrupted? Deleted? Patricia could hear the response, muffled but tense, through the receiver. Then Douglas's jaw clenched. I see. A pause. Send me everything you have. He hung up. The room felt eerily quiet. Patricia barely breathed. What happened? Douglas's fingers drummed once against the table before he leaned in. The kitchen footage from the night Walter died, he said slowly. Everything between 8:45 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. is gone. Patricia's stomach dropped. Gone, she whispered. Like erased? Douglas exhaled sharply. That's what it looks like. Patricia shook her head. That's impossible. That system backs up automatically. The files can't just disappear. Douglas met her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but Patricia could feel the shift. Someone had tampered with the footage, and there were only two possibilities. Someone was trying to protect her, or someone was trying to frame her. A chill crawled up her spine. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just fighting to prove her innocence. She was fighting against someone who had planned this from the beginning, and that meant one terrifying thing. The real murderer was still out there. Patricia's breath came shallow. The walls of the courthouse conference room felt like they were closing in, missing footage. Someone had erased the most crucial part of the night Walter died. The exact window of time when he had his last drink. Douglas sat across from her, his fingers laced together, his expression unreadable. This changes everything, he murmured. Patricia's mind raced. Do we tell the judge? Douglas hesitated. Not yet. He leaned forward. Patricia, if this was a sloppy mistake, I'd say, sure, let's raise hell. But this was deliberate. Someone wanted that footage gone. His voice dropped lower. And we need to figure out who, before we tip them off. A shiver ran down Patricia's spine. Eleanor, her mother-in-law, had been in the kitchen that night. Charlotte had seen something. And now, the only footage that could have confirmed or denied, it had mysteriously vanished. Patricia's hands tightened into fists. If someone deleted it, there has to be a backup somewhere. Douglas nodded. Already on it. The security company might still have a cloud archive. I have a tech guy digging. Patricia barely heard him. Her mind was already moving elsewhere. Walter had trusted Eleanor, respected her. But had he feared her? She thought back to the past, to the small things she had ignored. The way Eleanor would speak in measured, careful tones, but with words that always seemed to land like knives. The way she never fully accepted Patricia into the family, no matter how hard she tried. And then another memory surfaced, a week before Walter died. An argument, not between her and Walter, but between Walter and Eleanor. Patricia had heard them. She had been coming down the stairs when she caught the sharp edge of Walter's voice. I told you, this is my decision, Mother. Stay out of it. You're making a mistake, Walter, a grave mistake. Enough! A moment of silence. Then Eleanor's voice, quiet, almost calm. If you do this, there will be consequences. Patricia had walked away, telling herself it was just another disagreement, just business. But what if it wasn't? Her heart pounded as she looked up at Douglas. I need to go to the house. Douglas frowned. What? Why? Patricia swallowed hard. Because I think Eleanor knows more than she's letting on. And if the footage is gone, she took a deep breath. Maybe there's something else she didn't erase. Douglas stared at her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Let's go. Patricia couldn't leave the courthouse. She was the accused. A supposed Black Widow, a poisoner, a manipulator. They had already decided who she was. But Douglas could leave, and that's exactly what he did. As Patricia sat in the small attorney's room beside the courtroom, her heart pounded with every second that passed. He had gone to the Bennett mansion, claiming he needed to retrieve additional documents for the defense. But the documents were just an excuse. They were after the truth. The door burst open suddenly, and Douglas stepped inside. His face was tense. His usually pristine suit was slightly disheveled. He had rushed back. Patricia stood immediately. "What did you find?" Douglas locked the door behind him before answering. He tossed an envelope onto the table. Inside was a toxicology report. Patricia frowned. "What is this?" Douglas leaned in, his voice low. "Remember when I requested an independent review of Walter's toxicology results? I wanted a second opinion, in case the original tests missed something." Patricia pulled the report from the envelope and began reading, line after line. Each word sucked the air from her lungs. The first toxicology report stated that Walter had died from a lethal dose of digitoxin, a highly toxic substance derived from plants, capable of inducing cardiac arrest. But the second report, conducted by a different lab, revealed something else, something that changed everything. Yes, Walter had been poisoned, but not with a single fatal dose. He had been poisoned for weeks. Patricia's eyes widened. This doesn't make sense." Douglas gripped the paper firmly. "Oh, but it does. If someone had been administering small doses over time, the symptoms would have seemed natural. Fatigue, shortness of breath, dizziness. Any doctor would have mistaken it for stress or heart problems." A cold wave of shock washed over Patricia. She tried to remember. Walter had complained about exhaustion for weeks. He had said he felt off. He had been taking medication, assuming it was just another health issue. But someone had been slowly poisoning him, and on the night of his death, he had received the final dose. Douglas pressed his hands against the table. "Patricia, this means the tea that night wasn't the beginning of the plan." His voice was sharp. It was the end of it. Her eyes stayed locked on the report in front of her. If this was true, then Walter's murder wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated, it was calculated, and if the poison had already been in his system before that night, that meant she never had a chance to save him. Someone had already decided that Walter Bennett would die, and now that same person was sitting in the courtroom, watching calmly as Patricia was torn apart. The courtroom was restless. People whispered, exchanged glances, sensed that something had changed. Patricia sat beside Douglas, her pulse racing. The toxicology report had shifted everything, but it wasn't enough. They needed something definitive, something undeniable. The judge called the court back to order. Gregory Martinez, the prosecutor, looked irritated. He'd been so confident, so certain that Patricia was guilty. But now, for the first time, she saw something else in his face. Doubt. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Powell, the defense may proceed." Douglas stood. His movements were calm, calculated. "Your Honor, I would like to call one last witness to the stand." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge frowned. "Mr. Powell, the defense has already rested its case." "I understand, Your Honor." Douglas turned, his expression unreadable. "But this witness has new information, information that could prove who truly killed Walter Bennett." Patricia's breath caught. The judge hesitated, then sighed. "Very well, bring in the witness." The courtroom doors creaked open, and in walked Charlotte. Gasps filled the room. Patricia's heart clenched as she watched her daughter, small and fragile, clutching her porcelain doll with both hands. But Charlotte wasn't crying. She was staring directly at Eleanor. Eleanor, who for the first time looked nervous. Douglas approached Charlotte gently. "Charlotte, do you remember the night your daddy got sick?" Charlotte nodded. "Can you tell us what you saw?" She squeezed her doll tighter. Her voice was soft but clear. "Nana was in the kitchen." A few murmurs. Eleanor's hands clenched on her lap. Douglas nodded encouragingly. "What was Nana doing, sweetheart?" Charlotte hesitated. "Then she had 2 cups." Silence. Patricia felt the air leave her lungs. Douglas's voice remained steady. 2 cups? Charlotte nodded. 1 for Mommy, 1 for Daddy. More murmurs spread through the courtroom. The tension thickened. Douglas took a slow step forward. Charlotte, what happened to the cups? Charlotte blinked. Nana switched them. A collective gasp filled the room. Patricia's hands flew to her mouth. Douglas turned to the judge. Your Honor, we have proof that Walter Bennett was poisoned over weeks. Charlotte's testimony confirms that Eleanor Bennett handled the tea. That night, his voice hardened, the wrong person is on trial. Eleanor shot up from her seat. This is absurd, but her voice wavered. The jury watched her, the prosecutor watched her. The weight of Charlotte's words hung over the room like a blade. Eleanor had switched the cups, and now she had nowhere left to hide. For a long moment no one moved. Eleanor stood there, her breath uneven, her fingers tightening around the arms of her chair. She was cornered. Patricia felt her heart hammering. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew. This was the moment Eleanor would break. Gregory Martinez, the prosecutor, was no longer looking at Patricia. He was looking at Eleanor. Mrs. Bennett, he said, his voice slow, measured. Would you care to explain why your granddaughter just testified that you switched the cups that night? Eleanor's lips parted. Her eyes darted toward Patricia. Something flashed across her face. Not anger, not fear, resignation, and then she started laughing, soft at first, almost bitter. The entire courtroom stiffened. Eleanor shook her head, a cold smile curling at the edge of her lips. You're all so naive, she murmured. Do you really think Walter was some innocent man? Her voice sent a chill through Patricia's bones. The judge banged his gavel. Mrs. Bennett, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully. Eleanor ignored him. She turned to Patricia. Did you ever wonder, dear, why Walter was so stressed those last few months? Her voice was like a knife slicing through silk. Why he suddenly had so many secrets? Patricia's stomach twisted. What are you talking about? Eleanor tilted her head. Walter had enemies. He made promises he couldn't keep. He took things that didn't belong to him. Her smile faded. And someone was going to make him pay. A deadly silence fell over the room. Patricia's mind spun. Was she saying Walter's death wasn't just a murder? Douglas stepped forward. Mrs. Bennett, are you admitting to poisoning your own son? Eleanor's face turned ice cold. I did what I had to do, she said simply. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs. Someone dropped a pen. Patricia felt sick. Eleanor straightened her posture. Walter was a fool, she said, but if he had just listened to me, if he had just done as he was told, he wouldn't have ended up dead. The judge slammed his gavel. Enough! Bailiff, take Mrs. Bennett into custody. The guards moved. Instantly, Eleanor didn't fight. As they cuffed her hands, she turned one last time to Patricia. Her eyes were unreadable. You should be grateful, she murmured. If it hadn't been me, someone else would have done it. A shiver ran down Patricia's spine. Then just like that, Eleanor Bennett was led out of the courtroom, and Patricia was free. 1 week later, Patricia sat on the porch of her small rented house, watching Charlotte play in the yard. The trial was over. The headlines had changed. The world had moved on. But Patricia hadn't. She had spent so much time fighting for her life that she hadn't stopped to think about what came after. Douglas had offered to help her sue the state, to go after those who had rushed to call her guilty, but she wasn't sure if she wanted to keep fighting. Not anymore. Charlotte giggled, spinning in circles, her porcelain doll clutched tightly in her arms. Patricia exhaled. She had lost her old life, but maybe, just maybe, she had gained something else. Some truths take time to surface, but justice always finds a way. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More thrilling stories are just around the corner.